buy Bucky Irving. Now, I understand that most of the fantasy football world already recognizes that Bucky Irving's been an efficient back without this huge ceiling because of the presence of Rachaad White. If Rachaad White wasn't in Tampa Bay, everyone would be very high on Bucky Irving. But I think there's a chance for some high upside games down the stretch for Irving. Now, Irving's coming off a game in week 10 because they had a bye in week 11 where he ranked as a top 10 running back in PPR formats. I'm not trying to sell this as some buy low moment. It's just that we haven't seen a massive game from Irving this year. He's maxed out at 18.5 PPR points. And again, that's largely because of a split backfield. He hasn't had a 50% snap share since week 6. But I talked about this in the mailbag episode last week. Tampa Bay running backs, they play certain roles in this offense. Irving's kind of a do-it-all back. He can do everything for them. Rachaad White, though, takes more of the pass-catching duties. On the season, according to Fantasy Life data, White's seen about 77% of the team's long down and distance snaps. That's led to about a 14% target share per game rate. That's 6 percentage points higher than Bucky Irving's. So if you believe the Bucs are going to see negative game scripts, then Rachaad White would be your preferred running back in that backfield. But that might not happen down the stretch. The Buccaneers' remaining opponents through the end of the fantasy season, the Giants, Panthers, Raiders, Chargers, Cowboys, and Panthers. Not only does that give them the best remaining schedule by adjusted fantasy points allowed for running backs, but they'll likely be favorites in all but one of those games. And because that schedule looks so good, the guy who could benefit in that backfield is Bucky Irving, at least more so than what we might see from Rachaad White. That's why I think right now, Irving's a buy. Add Jalen McMillan. So once again, the waiver wire is not that strong. Anecdotally, I feel like waiver wires this season have been the worst that I've ever seen as a fantasy analyst. So with that being said, I've talked about Jalen McMillan in the past. I don't think this is like a smash ad. Like, you absolutely need to go after McMillan. But I do think that fantasy managers have given up on him too soon. I want to give him at least 1 or 2 more weeks. We have to remember, he suffered a hamstring injury before week 9. He missed that game. And then in week 10, he didn't get any run. Now, was it because the Buccaneers all of a sudden want to use Ryan Miller instead? Probably not. Just look at McMillan's usage throughout the season. Look at his skill set. Look at his prospect profile. It's pretty unlikely that they want to use those wide receivers over McMillan. It was probably because of his injury. Now, Mike Evans is set to be back soon, and that could limit McMillan's ceiling. But this might be a case where McMillan just needs a player like Evans on the field to take some of the pressure off. Because the fact is, McMillan was a pretty good prospect. He is playing in a pretty decent offense. And his schedule down the stretch, also pretty good. And we can't forget that we often see rookie wide receivers close out that first season better than how they started. Their second half numbers are usually way better than their front half numbers. So this may amount to nothing. I totally understand that. It's not like Jalen McMillan has dominated since Chris Godwin got hurt. But I'm still anticipating that he runs a lot of routes in this Bucs offense. And it's an offense with a pretty strong rest of season schedule. Hold or buy Kyren Williams. So Kyren Williams started the 2024 season by recording a touchdown in 6 straight games. But since week 7, he's only found the end zone once. And that touchdown, it came through the air. It wasn't on the ground. The Rams were massive regression candidates with how they were scoring their touchdowns, at least to start the year. I talked about that on 10 Trends. From week 1 through week 7, they had 3 passing touchdowns and 8 rushing touchdowns. Regardless of what was going on with Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp and the fact that they were sidelined, regardless of that, that number, the way they were scoring touchdowns, was going to regress. It was going to start skewing towards the pass more. The problem is that now it's gone too far in that direction. Over their last 4 games, those are 4 games with Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp, LA has 10 passing touchdowns and 0 rushing touchdowns. Now, they've definitely been more pass heavy close to the end zone. Those kinds of things are happening. That's going to happen when your receiving weapons return to action. But 10 passing touchdowns without a rushing touchdown is not normal. The Rams should be somewhere in the middle. The expectation can't be the 3 to 8 pass to rush touchdown ratio they saw to start the year. But it also can't be 10 passing touchdowns and 0 rushing touchdowns. Now, there's definitely a narrative out there that suggests that Williams is performing worse in fantasy football because Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua are back. There is some truth to that, but there's a lot of just dumb luck playing a role here. And the good news is that the Rams rushing schedule, it's a lot better than the passing one from now through the end of the year. Rams running backs have the 12th best rest of season schedule by adjusted fantasy points allowed. The quarterback one is 26th best. The wide receiver one, 22nd. And that same difference is seen during the fantasy playoffs. They get the 49ers, Jets, and Cardinals. Now, I'm not sure if Williams is just a straight up buy candidate because there's going to be a lot of anchoring bias involved with Kyren Williams. He started the season off so hot. People anchor their takes to how he started the season. What I do want to call out here, though, is that I do see Kyren Williams regressing back to the mean. He's going to score more touchdowns. And to me, the schedule does favor him more than the passing attack. So maybe at the end of the day, that does make him a buy. Add Christian Watson. Now, I know Christian Watson's not available in your league. But look, I got to cater to shallower leagues here too. He's still out there in 56% of Yahoo leagues. It's not like every 12-team league has Christian Watson rostered, but he should be added. He's getting more work in this Green Bay offense. From week 1 through week 7, in games where Watson was active, he was running a normal number of routes, he averaged a target share per game rate of just 9%. Over his last 3 games, though, his target share numbers have been 22%, 19%, and 24%. And his route participation has gradually increased. We know that Watson has big play upside. If that's what your team needs, then you should be adding him. Sell Jameson Williams. So sort of similar to Christian Watson, we know that Jameson Williams can also make those splash plays. And we've seen that this year. Williams has played 8 games. 2 of those games have resulted in 20 plus PPR points. And also 2 of those games have resulted in fewer than 2 PPR points. It's always smart to lead with peripherals though. And while Williams' target shares haven't been that bad of late, they haven't been consistent all season long. He's seen target shares of 21% and 19% over his last 2 games. But he averaged an 11% target share per game rate in his 4 games prior to that. That's not very usable. Now, interestingly, Williams hasn't faced a single opponent this year that ranks as a bottom 12 one for wide receivers by adjusted points allowed. 7 of his 8 matchups have been against teams who rank as top half favorable opponents for wide receivers within that metric. And from now through the end of the year, the Lions get the Colts. That's the 14th best matchup in adjusted points allowed to wide receivers. So that's not a terrible matchup. But then the Bears, who are 28th, the Packers, who are 24th, the Bills, who are 20th, the Bears, who are 28th, who I just said, and the 49ers, who are 25th. They have a bottom 5 rest of season schedule according to my numbers. Now, that's not everything, but I already talked about his peripherals, and his peripherals are very inconsistent. Some of you might want off this roller coaster. You don't want those spiked weeks because you know that they come with really poor weeks too. And if that's the case, this could be a time to sell. Because yes, that schedule is tough, but also he's coming off a 22-point outing. He had a good game in week 11. So right now might be the time to sell Jameson Williams. Add Elijah Moore. I've talked about Elijah Moore in the Sleeper Show, but let's just formalize things a little bit. Let's talk about him in the 15 transactions one. Amari Cooper's now been out of Cleveland for 4 games. Moore scored 10 plus PPR points in 3 of those 4 outings. He's averaging a 20.3% target share per game rate. That's not bad at all. And you might think that Moore's just been seeing low A-dot targets. That's not really the case. In week 11, according to PFF, his A-dot was 18.8. That was the highest on the Browns. Now, since Amari Cooper's been gone, his A-dot has been slightly lower than Jerry Jeudy and Cedric Tillman by about a couple of yards. But we're not talking about like a Wan'Dale Robinson type role out of the slot for Elijah Moore. He's seeing pretty decent usage. Now, I said this before with Cedric Tillman, but Cleveland does have a pretty brutal schedule from now through the end of the fantasy season. They get Pittsburgh twice alongside Denver over their next 3 games. And then the fantasy playoffs, they get the Chiefs, Bengals, and Dolphins. So it's not a cakewalk. but I do think that more should be rostered in 12-team leagues. Buy Calvin Ridley. So people might be turned off by Calvin Ridley's Week 11 stat line, but he did have a 51-yard touchdown that was taken away by an illegal formation penalty. Had he converted, then we're talking about a third 20-plus PPR point performance for Ridley across 4 games without DeAndre Hopkins. Calvin Ridley has been very good from a fantasy perspective without Hopkins. He's averaging a target share per game rate of 32% over this 4-game stretch. And despite not getting that touchdown, his PPR points per game is at 18. If he maintains that kind of usage, he's going to overperform rest of season. It's part of the reason I've been higher on him versus the market over the last month in my rest of season rankings. Because the Titan wide receivers have a top 5 schedule from here on out. And in the fantasy playoffs, they get the Bengals, the Colts, and the Jags. Those are all top half matchups for wide receivers. 2 of those matchups are top 5 ones. I truly think that Calvin Ridley has a legit chance to do some serious damage down the stretch. And I've been saying it for some time now, but not a lot of people care about this Titans offense. And understandably so. But there can still be good fantasy assets out of bottom half offenses. I think that's what we're getting with Calvin Ridley. Add Roschon Johnson. So we've talked about Roschon Johnson at times this year. Not a whole lot has come of those discussions. But with that being said, the Bears played their first game without Shane Waldron as offensive coordinator this past Sunday. And things were a little bit different in that backfield. In DeAndre Swift's 3 games leading up to that game on Sunday, he had running back rush shares of 90%, 84%, and 94%. Against the Packers, it was 58%. He ended up with the second lowest snap share of his season. And it's because Roschon Johnson took a lot of those short yardage downs. He had a 41.7% running back rush share, which was a season high. I say this all the time, but coaches dictate backfields. They can say, I want this backfield to be split regardless of the talent back there. And if they want to switch things up, they can switch things up. And we as fantasy managers, we have to listen because volume directly impacts fantasy football. Now, the Bears have a brutal rest of season schedule for running backs, but Johnson should still be rostered. He's a potential flex play in deeper formats with contingent upside. Hold Bo Nix. Bo Nix has averaged 21.5 fantasy points per game since week 4. And I just got to get it out there. He's not a streamer. He's a full-blown QB1 in fantasy football. And I think some of you need to hear that because Nix is still available in way too many leagues. I'm not sure things are going to substantially slow down either. According to PFF's expected fantasy points formula, Nix has actually played a little bit under expectation this season. And the same can be said when you look from week 5 onward. The Broncos also face a favorable quarterback schedule through the end of the year. And in the fantasy playoffs, they get games against the Colts, that's the 8th best matchup for quarterbacks by adjusted points allowed, and the Bengals, which is the 3rd best one. You may not be able to play only Bo Nix in your quarterback spot through the end of the year, but there's no chance that I'd be treating him as a backup at this point. Drop Diontae Johnson. Look, you need to look at your roster if you have Diontae Johnson, and you just need to ask yourself, is he more valuable than a high-end handcuff? And it's really hard to say yes. Because in his 3 games with Baltimore, he's seen route participation rates of 27%, 8%, and 17%. That's laughably bad. Now, Johnson's likely going to see that number increase, or we would expect that to increase. But are you going to have enough confidence to actually slot him into your lineup when that time comes? Not only that, but the Ravens still have a bye in week 14. Like, I can understand holding on to Diontae Johnson on deeper rosters or ones where wide receivers mean a lot, in leagues where wide receivers get a lot of points and you're starting a lot of them. You can cross your fingers and just hold Diontae Johnson. But it's really hard to see a path to true relevancy at this pace. Like, even when the playoffs hit, if we haven't seen anything from Diontae Johnson, even if he does give us production, it's not going to be very predictable production. That's my fear. And we can sit here and we can say that Diontae Johnson's good, that he's better than Rashad Bateman. But the Ravens have their system. They do things the way they do them offensively. Baltimore, through their actions and even Diontae Johnson's play, they've shown us that he may not be their wide receiver too. And we need to all accept that. Add Adam Thielen. So Adam Thielen's set to return for the Panthers this week. He hasn't played since week 3 when he caught that touchdown against the Raiders. I don't think our expectations should be sky high with him, but I think he's worth a stash just to see what happens. I don't think judging Thielen on his 2.5 games in 2024 is really that fair. Not only is that a small sample size, but he was playing with Diontae Johnson at the time. The Panthers' offense was also largely a dumpster fire back then. He still had a respectable 1.47 yards per route run rate, though, during that time frame, earlier this year. That number's a lot better, for the record, than what Xavier Legette has seen all season long in yards per route run. I think we'll see 3 wide receiver sets of Xavier Legette, Jalen Coker, and Adam Thielen. The question is, who's going to play the slot? And I don't really have an answer for that right now. I think you just have to add Adam Thielen and see if he has any juice left. There's a chance that he becomes a target magnet in that offense because it lacks established pass catchers. Why not take the chance? Buy Jonathan Taylor. Now look, it's tough to be super optimistic about a running back playing in an offense with a mobile quarterback who's been pretty inaccurate all season long. But there's a chance that you can really buy low on Jonathan Taylor this week, because over his last 3 games, he scored 8.9, 14.2, and 7.0 PPR points. But his peripherals are absolutely there. He leads the NFL this year in games with a 100% running back rush share despite missing time this season. He's now hit that mark in 3 of his last 4. He's just been underperforming. According to PFF's expected fantasy points metric, Taylor should be at about 17.2 PPR points per game over his last 3. That's based on his volume and where he's seeing his touches. Instead, he's been at 10.0. That's the largest delta in the league. Now, there's nothing overly special about the Colts' rest of season schedule, and they get a tough one against the Lions here in week 12. It's just that if you want to make a higher upside move, this is probably the one to make. Add Ameer Abdullah. Both Zamir White and Alexander Mattison were banged up in their week 11 loss to the Dolphins. That helped Ameer Abdullah hit a 10+ PPR point game for just the second time this season. If either guy is out this week, Abdullah could take on a larger role in that Vegas offense, especially on the pass catching front. So if both guys are out, he could be a flex-worthy play. And then also keep an eye on Dylan Laube. He'd get more run if White and Mattison are both out. You just want to monitor this situation. That's what this transaction's all about. White and Mattison would get priority over both Abdullah and Laube, obviously. So if only Mattison is out, then you'll want to snag Zamir White. It's more so that if both of them are out, then Abdullah and Laube would get a lot more run. Sell Austin Ekeler. So Austin Ekeler's put together a few big outings in a row. In week 9, we saw him score 17 PPR points against the Giants. In week 10, he had 18 PPR points against the Steelers. And then in week 11, he had 17.6 against the Eagles. Now keep in mind, Brian Robinson missed those games against New York and Pittsburgh. He was back last week though. And Ekeler did see his snap share drop a little bit to 52%. That was still better than his season-long average, but it's not a significantly high number. The thing is, Ekeler saw a season-best 28% target share against the Eagles. That's the crux of this transaction. His route participation has been okay all season long, but nothing in week 11 suggested that he should have seen that high of a target share. Aside from like the matchup, I'm talking about usage. He had a 59% route participation rate. He's been that high in the past. So you have to ask yourself, why hasn't his target share been that high? Well, it's because a 28% target share is really hard to hit. He's almost definitely not going to see a target share that high rest of season. So if someone's willing to pay up for his recent performance, knowing that his target share was inflated and knowing that Brian Robinson was sidelined, trading him away right now makes a lot of sense. Add the Tampa Bay Buccaneers defense. So the Buccaneers are going to face Tommy DeVito this week. They're 5.5-point road favorites. New York with Daniel Jones has been the 4th best matchup for fantasy defenses this year by adjusted points allowed. Maybe Tommy DeVito's a huge upgrade, but I don't necessarily see that happening. I think overall, the Giants are still an offense that we want to target. But this Buccaneers defense could have long-term value too. As I talked about earlier, they have a strong rest of season schedule. After the Giants this week, it's Carolina, then Vegas. Those are two teams that you could use the Buccaneers against. Then it's the Chargers. You probably don't want to use them there. But after them, it's the Dak Prescott-less Cowboys and then the Panthers once again. So maybe you're in a league that hoards defenses, or maybe you're in a league that limits transactions. If that's the case, you might want to consider being a little bit more aggressive and getting Tampa Bay this week, because they could work through the end of the year for the most part. At the very least, though, they actually work over the next 3 weeks.